Joey Clark.
Welcome back. Now, as promised, looking forward to this conversation, we have on the program with us Alan Mendenhall. Alan, how are you today, sir?
I'm great, Joey. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and I want to share something cool. I just discovered this Twitter page or X page called 1776 Live. So they're like acting as though here's exactly what was happening 250 years ago. So 3 hours ago, they put out that Thomas Paine publishes an open letter to the Pennsylvania Evening Post under the name Republicus, which advocates for the name the United States of America for the new nation now emerging. This is the first time such a term's been used. Of course, Paine became famous in January 250 years ago for Common Sense. The independent state of Virginia today adopts a constitution. They declared independence 7 weeks ago. And yesterday, 250 years ago yesterday, Thomas Jefferson submits the final draft of his Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. And you've got, looking at a photo here of that draft. And you, Alan, recently did a review on a book that was really breaking down the Declaration. And I have yet to read that book, but it sounds like it's a fascinating take, almost letting the Declaration speak for itself in a way.
Yeah, it's written by actually a friend of mine, Matthew Spalding, who's dean of the DC campus, the Kirby Center campus over in basically directly across the street from the Heritage Foundation. But he and I have known each other for a long time through the Philadelphia Society. But great book, and it takes its title from the phrase "the American Mind." The Claremont Institute also has a website and a publication called The American Mind. But that's from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1825 to Henry Lee. And he said that basically the Declaration was his expression of the American mind. But yeah, it's a really well done work. It reads almost like literary criticism in that it doesn't just do the historical thing, but it analyzes the words very carefully, does a close reading. And, rather than taking each of those famous phrases in isolation, Matt organizes all the chapters around the Declaration's own language. And he looks at the text as if it's like a symphony or a poem, and emphasizes how each particular section contributes to a more coherent whole and forms an argument. And he talks about the British legal tradition. He talks about how Christianity is the foundation of self-government. He talks about how the treatment of slavery is debated, and how parts of Jefferson's text get excised from the final product. So yeah, it's a really fascinating book. And of course, as everyone listening to your show knows, we're in the semi-quincentennial. So what better time to read a book like this?
Yeah, and again, folks, it's called The Making of the American Mind. And one thing you highlighted in your review of it is how he focuses on just the word declaration. And, I think everyday people still do this, where you can make subtle allusions and everybody understands, especially in pop culture, what you're talking about. So the word declaration would have had this extra connotation to it that it would bring into people's minds something that when we see the word today, maybe we just think, fancy word for I'm saying something.
Yeah, like a declaration, not just in the casual, colloquial way in which we use the form, but in a very formal sense in the English political and constitutional tradition, where a representative body is announcing a constitutional change. And that's a really important thing. This is like, it'd be like us using the word complaint in a casual way versus like a complaint, which is a formal pleading that you file in a court. Like the word declaration had that formal context.
Well, and it stretches into, it's interesting, like how British the founders were still and thought of themselves as Englishmen, and appealing to that long history that often in tradition that wasn't written down. It's like they're finally putting a stamp with this independent American streak.
Yeah, and that's why I actually dislike the term American Revolution for the period, because I don't feel that our framers, at least most of them, they weren't revolutionaries. They weren't trying to innovate and create something entirely new and without precedent. they actually saw themselves as protecting and preserving the ancient rights and liberties that they enjoyed as Englishmen. And so the Declaration of Independence is part of a textual network that goes back to the Petition of Rights, the Bill of Rights, Magna Carta. It's got antecedents. And in that sense, it's looking to the past rather than toward a future that doesn't exist. And if you compare our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen of the French, find a lot of distinction, a lot of differences. The French appeal to abstractions, and their document is much more radical than our Declaration of Independence. Of course, there are things that are still debated within the Declaration of Independence. We have notions of equality, notions of popular sovereignty, and we still debate what those mean. But in terms of significance, I can think of fewer political documents, except for maybe Magna Carta, that have had more enduring relevance to politics, not just in the United States, but globally.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here wondering, especially the way DC still operates, and we're getting some good Supreme Court rulings in the last several years, but for all the idea we have a written constitution as opposed to the unwritten British Constitution, it seems like we still have this unwritten living thing that operates very much like the British system. I mean, I wonder, did we really accomplish something by writing it down? Now, I think I could argue different ways of this, but what do you think of that we still seem to have that very British sense of, well, it's not officially written down, and even if it is, we'll reinterpret it?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've never quite in 250 years, more than that, in fact, because we had common law imported before the Declaration of Independence, of course, but we've never quite figured out what it means to incorporate the common law on this side of the pond. Now, of course, our Constitution, which is far more recent than the Declaration, we have the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but with that framework in place, with those guardrails in place, we've not quite figured out how the common law works here. Each state has its own common law system. Even in Louisiana, which is supposed to be on a civil law code, the only state that exists on that kind of old Napoleonic code model, there's still something like the common law taking place, in the sense that judges do tend to recognize stare decisis. They do tend to follow precedent of their other judges because it gives them cover for the opinion that they're issuing. But in terms of what it means to have a common law tradition in a system in which there is a governing, overarching architecture, and that is the Constitution, how fixed is that Constitution? What do you do when there are questions of interpretation? Of course, the provisions of the Constitution that deal with federalism are fairly vague and do allow for some flexibility. So what is the judge's role? How does precedent work? These are all questions that we're still working out. Now, interestingly enough, since the rise of originalism in the 1980s, we've seen a particular judicial hermeneutic solidify. So even, justices like Kagan are, as Kagan famously said in the confirmation hearing, we're all textualists now. But even Justice Jackson, who is coming up with some pretty harebrained opinions and writing some somewhat ridiculous things, is at least constrained by the originalist textualist hermeneutic and is trying to do her historicism, her history, in that mold. Even though she's reaching some strange conclusions every now and then, she's at least having to go through the methodology.
Right. At least. And there's something to be said about that methodology. Maybe it doesn't produce the result that you want in the moment, but it tends to produce really great results over the generations. I want to real quick, though, go back to the founding, and I should have probably texted you this beforehand, but could you think of like different points in your life where you thought about the founding generation, you thought about the revolution, and has it changed at all or adjusted, like your perspective on, say, what those men did 250 years ago?
Well, I can remember studying the founding in school, in particular in middle school, and being inspired by figures like Thomas Jefferson, being inspired by figures like Patrick Henry. Something about these Virginians was very appealing to me. I can recall my parents taking me to Mount Vernon in eighth grade. I was in eighth grade at the time. So all these things were hitting back to back to back right when I was in middle school, and sort of inspired my love of I don't know, government, politics, law, at least my love of studying those things. Um, and my views of the founders have probably evolved in different ways, just as I've gotten older and more sophisticated. And one simplistic way of putting it is this: you know, there's a tendency on one extreme to try to glorify and lionize the founders as if they were these perfect beings doing awesome things. And then on the other side, it's just to demonize them and trash them and treat them as products of this horrible time when everybody wanted slavery and all this kind of stuff. Well, both of those are highly problematic approaches. And I think the best way to teach the founders is warts and all, but not all warts. So
Right.
many people want to teach them as all warts, but you teach them warts and all, not all warts. I mean, if you look at all the freedoms that they enabled, I mean, without sort of this liberalism tradition that the founders were part of, would you have had the end of slavery? Would you have ever had the civil rights movement? I mean, think about Frederick Douglass as couching language in the terms of the Declaration. The abolitionists are hearkening back to the Declaration, civil rights movement hearkening back to the Declaration. And now all of a sudden we have people who purport to be liberating forces who would reject out of hand the Declaration because Thomas Jefferson's pen was involved. That's ridiculous to me.
Right. It is ridiculous. You said simplistic, but I thought that was quite well and eloquent. And I find I was as a kid, I'm just the memory came back. I won in like 10th or 11th grade some speech class and gave some speech on the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I remember, I think I'd literally describe the founding generation as like demigods. But to your point, how impressive is it for a demigod to do like amazing things? Whereas if you take a real flesh and blood human being, a sinner, fallen, a lot of warts, and they still are able in this one time in history to do amazing things that almost seem like God's little G did it. That's an even better story. And yeah, it seems like our brothers and sisters today who want to constantly rip things down, like you're ruining the story. Like every story has an arc and has this messiness. But then, of course, I guess there are other angles that come up for me of like you look at the people like Alexander Hamilton and like the Federalist letters and or so many of the things that came out, the amount of political Machiavellian political gamesmanship was going on. I don't think there's enough given when we do these official celebrations. Unlike from the get-go, these guys are cutthroat after they win their independence with each other.
Well, one thing that amazes me, like just looking at the Federalist Papers that Madison authored, is how he's like a proto public choice economist in so many ways. He makes these claims about different theories about human nature that really predate any sort of empirical or quantitative studies. And it turns out we have all this, all this economics and all this sociology and all these quantitative fields now that tend to affirm some of the claims Madison makes about the way political actors behave. And he didn't have recourse to this type of mathematical evidence. He was just a keen observer of human nature and could say, like, look, people tend to do this, and this is what power does. And that's a really important thing to emphasize with the founders is their awareness of the dangers of power. And, you know, they understood that they were flawed beings. They didn't think of themselves as being, perfect entities. Far from it. They were concerned about, the sinful state of human nature, which is why we have things like checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism and bicameral legislatures and all these different things are designed to check power. They were a bunch of little Frodos. They knew what happened when you had the ring, and they were trying to take the ring and chop it up into a lot of different pieces so that no one person could hold it, because that would just be too dangerous.
Yeah, but it is like, I think you're absolutely right, but it's funny how they all realize we're a bunch of different Frodos, and they all become Boromir within years when it comes to one another. And it is fascinating. Like you mentioned comparing the revolution here to the French Revolution, how the French really do upend the very nature of like God and the metaphysics that had governed them for so long. Like, what did they do to the Cathedral of Notre Dame? Like, the Temple of Reason or Church of Reason or something like that. And you saw like how power almost became demonic in the amount of blood that was spilled by the French and the legacies of that. And whereas it does seem like this truly is a Christian nation that had that Christian humility, despite all their power games and all the interesting, gnarly history of the early period, there is this sense that, no, we're children under God. That gives us rights free of government, but also that, maybe we should humble ourselves before we praise ourselves too much.
Absolutely. I mean, basically all the founders were members of or attended different churches, and the people that are pointed to as exceptions, like Jefferson and Franklin, and are called deists, were clearly people who acknowledged a providence, acknowledged God. And Jefferson has his own Bible where he excises the miracles and things like that. And
Right.
but clearly he is a theist, not an atheist, but a theist, someone who believes in God. And of course, Benjamin Franklin famously at the Constitutional Convention calls for prayer so that they can get through this process and form an operative government. And so, this is a very different thing from, as you pointed out, the French Revolution, which was doing all kinds of things, right down to the calendar. Let's try to throw out the calendar. Let's try to reinvent all this stuff, from scratch. And that is a very different experience. And it's why a political theorist like Edmund Burke, who is the Anglo-Irish statesman, conservative, founder of modern conservatism, at least in terms of political theory, would support the American Revolution, but be horrified by the French Revolution.
Yeah, and it does seem like, for all the point you made about Madison, how he was able to just anticipate a lot of what has been later developed by, say, more modern methods, just his study of human nature, and he's able to essentially come up with public choice out of that. It's pretty impressive. I opened up the show. I just read over the weekend J.D. Vance's new book, and it wrote us kind of a review, but it was more compare and contrast of myself and my own return journey with Vice President Vance, and a lot of common things as millennial men, especially culturally, but some personal stuff too. That said, Vance advances a lot of different, let's say, secular arguments, like anthropological, sociological, political, economic, for why have so many people left the faith for the last, say, few generations. And what I came back to, and I think Vance subtly comes back to it, he doesn't say it outright, I think he would agree though, is maybe the church is right. The reason so many people have left is sin. And, that could be, people think of it as this finger wagging, like just looking down and judging folks. But no, if you actually understand, say, nuanced theology of what we mean by sin, that explains a lot of what we see. And perhaps if we put that at the center of our understanding, it's fascinating how the modern secular descriptions actually take on more life.
That's really, I think that's insightful, Joey. So much of what Jesus teaches is paradoxes, things that seem as though they would be the inverse. And one of those is the notion of being enslaved to sin, because a lot of people think, oh, I'm out of religion, I'm free, I can go do all this stuff. But what you're actually doing is you're enslaving yourself to sin. And you are governed, controlled by sin. It dominates you, when actually the liberation comes from submitting yourself, giving yourself up to Jesus Christ. And that's where you get liberation. It's actually complete denial of the self is totally liberating, and giving yourself over to Jesus Christ is a liberating experience. Whereas What you do with sin is something entirely different. I mean, you have a certain Christian agency, which is different from the complete enslavement to sin. And that's why the whole line of, gosh, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. Why this is so hard, but it's not meant to be easy.
And without going into the dirty details, in the last several months, especially as I started on this journey, that particular verse you just cited came to life for me. Like, I felt it so, like, in my flesh, literally. Like, I know this is wrong, but I'm doing it anyway. Like, I'm reading the Bible, then I'm going and sinning right after. Like, what is wrong with me? And it's amazing how those words come back to life when you really start to let it lead you.
Well, it's true, but it's always helpful to know that, like, the apostles suffered with all the same things. They suffered they suffered through the same things, and we make the same mistakes. And grace is nevertheless available to us just as much as it was available to Paul or to Peter. Or, we still have grace too.
Now, I want to talk about something now next. And again, folks, we're talking to Alan Mendenhall, and it's the PCF out today, running for home. And I would say this is there's a particular gift of grace that shines through this. Well, and that's, I guess, the way I'd like to ask you about it, because people could go read it. It's Alan Mendenhall running for home. It's at 1819news.com. But I've been my own journey recently wondering, where do these little memories come from? Like these luminous memories that stick with you. And it seems like this particular one about your grandmother is like you just brought it to life. Like I got a little glimpse inside that gift of your memory. So where do you think this comes from, and why did this particular one strike you this week?
Well, the story of my grandmother playing baseball in high heels is told often in my family, because I don't know what it's like to wear high heels, but apparently, I'm knocking things over here. Apparently, that's a difficult thing to do. And everyone just sort of found it funny that she would go out and play baseball in high heels, because as she's running through the turf, of course, they peg into the ground, but if she gets on the concrete, they tap, 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 tap. But we recently played baseball at my parents' house, and it was me, my son Noah, my oldest son, who's 14, my daughter Gabriella, who's 12, my mom, and my dad. And we all went out there. My mom has recently gotten knee replacements, one before football season, one after football season, so that she could actually enjoy football season. My family orients their entire lives around football. But we were playing, and of course, it brought back all these memories for me of my grandmother playing baseball in the yard with us. And then I started realizing, oh, my kids are having this experience that I had with my grandparents. And I include I conclude with the phrase "safe at home." And I deliberately use that phrase because it has many different meanings. Literally, there's being safe at home plate, but there's also a sense of feeling safe at home. And when you finally feel yourself at home with your family, you feel safe. And so there are different meanings to that conclusion.
Yeah, and it's interesting how and we just talked about some of the founding generations and all the big history and everything that we're going to celebrate as a nation. But I almost feel like, I've got similar things. It's these little details that stick with you. That are, I think, the one that make you feel the most safe at home. It's, it's great to reminisce about the founding, but I don't know Thomas Jefferson. I never met him.
Yeah.
But I know my grandmother, and, how she, in her last Dirty Santa, even though she had a particular disease where she couldn't speak, but she was all there, and she stole the wine, Dirty Santa, from my grandmother, and that twinkle in her eye. And like, I always remember that final Christmas with her and how much fun and life she was having, even in her troubles. And it's stuff like that. And what you described, especially seeing it like, oh my goodness, my kids are experiencing what I'm experiencing. That just seems, I don't know, it matters more. It's less worldly than anything else.
It is. And there's so much wisdom embedded in our family histories. I can recall my great grandmother, who was born in 1903, whose dad fought in the Civil War. And I spent a lot of time with her, and I remember fishing with her, and I wish I could go back, because now that I'm an adult, I have so many questions. Like, I would love to ask her about her dad being in the Civil War. Like, what in the world? Like, that's access to like a totally different era of history. And I would like to learn from that. Unfortunately, I can't anymore, but, I did eat some really good food. I can remember her fried chicken and collard
Oh,
greens and mac and cheese and cornbread and all the rest. Things I can't even list because there were so many. And it was passed on to my grandmother. Of course, they thought their jobs were just to make me fat. That's all they did. I would come home from college and just eat, and it was awesome.
yeah, and I am living with my grandfather who'll be 90 in September.
Oh,
And
wow.
one thing I find fascinating as he reminisces, because he remembers one of his earliest memories is he was crying in the bathroom as a little boy. I believe he was born in 1936. So he's very young. He's crying in the bathroom as a little boy because the war just broke out with Pearl Harbor, and he's worried he's going to be sent off to go fight.
Oh,
And he's
wow.
only 5.
Oh,
And
wow.
so to see, and start the clock there of American history and everything that's happened, like there are all these amazing moments. And yet when you talk to him, he's like, yeah, but it was family life. He much prefers to talk about my mom and about my uncles. And, I'm like, yeah, but where were you during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Like you ran a Minuteman missile out at Strategic Air Command, and that stuff's cool. But it's not. It's interesting what sticks. It isn't all these big moments that we're supposed to remember publicly.
Yeah, you know what else is sort of weird is I was born in 1983, and remember growing up and seeing movies about the 1960s, reading about the 1960s, watching TV about the 1960s. And, 1963 was just 20 years before I was born, and it seemed alien. It seemed like another world. Well, now I'm looking at 2026 and I'm like, well, 2006 seems like it just happened to me. Like I was already out of college, like what? It's 2006. I was living in Japan, and I mean, 2006 is also when I started law school. It feels as if that just happened. How could that be the same amount of passage of time between now and then as it was between when I was born and the 1960s? When you start
It's
doing
crazy.
that and then you keep doing it back a few more decades, it gets even more shocking. You're just like, man, we're not all that far removed from the founding generation. It sure seems alien to us in many ways, but I can pick up their English and read it, and it's great. It's wonderful prose. I recognize it. It's not like reading Chaucer, where I have to labor to figure out what Chaucer is saying in moments. But yeah, even Chaucer's not that far. I mean, heck, our written records don't go back all that far.
Right. No, and it's thank you for the long segment. I've been flying solo today. If you got to run, I understand, but it reminds me of another takeaway I had reading J.D. Vance's book, and I think he only got like 5 years on me, and I'm noticing millennials, so to speak. I guess you'd be in the older. It's as would
Yeah,
J.D. Vance.
I'm millennial.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, millennials, we're going through this more nostalgic, reminiscent phase where we can look back on, especially like the 90s. And there's so much. And of course, there's the novelty in the pop culture and the video games and all that stuff. But I just started to realize, like, oh, wow, the guy who might be the next president of the United States, he too in college was a bit of a drunk jerk and he read too much Tucker Max. I hope they serve beer in hell. And it's like, oh, he also read Neil Strauss's The Game. And Ayn Rand was a big thing for his, and I'm like, wow, it's interesting to see that we're not that unique. We're all kind of swimming in the same generational stream.
Yeah, and one I think good thing about social media, people don't give social media very much praise, but one good thing about it is it sort of has um, equalized us in terms of awareness of our limitations. Because at this point, we used to hold figures up as if they were just impeccable, perfect people. And maybe there was something good about that. But I think also recognizing that we're all flawed and that our flaws are very easily exposed has, in some ways, you know, created room for solidarity and forgiveness and grace in a way that was more difficult perhaps before, when we had impossible standards by which we were measuring people, and people were um, uh, obsessed with hiding their bad activity rather than just owning it and saying, look, I did this, whatever. I always, I was not a big fan of a lot of things that George W. Bush did when he was president, but I always really respected him when he said, look, when I was young, this is what I did. This is how I behaved. And I wish I hadn't, but I'm owning it. And I really respected that.
Yeah. And I think we're going to need more of that because, and maybe that's a good thing. It'll defang sort of the Oppo research aspect of politics to where, I mean, everything's so public that, and, again, we're more on the older end of like this young generation coming up. Like the amount of stuff that's documented, like you're going to have to say mea culpa, max culpa. Like it's just, you're like, this is, sorry, I wish I was different. And I'm hoping more and more folks will show each other grace or we're going to rip each other apart. There's too much ammunition.
Yeah, I can't wait to figure out what historians will be doing 300, 400 years from now with our stuff and our digital footprint, because now we go through, someone's letters and we go through maybe whatever their banknotes say and maybe some legal documents here and there. But I mean, there's the potential for someone to get into your laptop and pull your cache data and pull all this. Like, who knows what types of biographies are going to be written in a few hundred years about us? I don't know. It's pretty incredible.
Well, Alan, this 30 minutes or so has flown by. If folks want to check out your work, your writing, what you're up to, how can they do so?
Just alanmendenhall.com is the best way to do it, Joey. I recently had someone go in there and update the website, so it's ready to go. It's got a lot of ads on it right now, so feel free to click on those. But but yeah, that's where it is.
Well, appreciate it, Alan, and we'll talk again soon. Have a happy 4th of July.
You too, Joey.
Again, folks, Alan Mendenhall, always appreciate his time